Okay, next up we have Pete Blackshaw, who is leading the next panel. He is Executive Vice President for Digital Strategic Services for Nielsen. So you may all know Nielsen as the measurement company that measures television ratings and now online ratings and net strategies. What Pete does is a little bit different. He advises companies, nonprofits. He said to me earlier today that he had gotten numerous requests from nonprofits to have lunch or dinner or talk about strategy, and he just told them to join this conference to take care of the whole thing in one fell swoop. And he has a panelist, an esteemed panel that are coming to join him, and he will introduce them, and I think that they are all mic'd. So, welcome to their panel on choosing your social media strategy. Pete?
Okay, we are going to get in the weeds and really talk about social media strategy from a number of vantage points. And what I thought I would do is first, good to see you, sir. Good to see you. So my panelists are Keith Hampton from the University of Pennsylvania, and he's actually focusing on social media. He's also been a big part, I think a founder, I believe, of ineighborhood.org, right? That's and we'll hear about that in a moment. And Geoff Livingston, to his left, actually spent quite a bit of time looking at everything he's been doing, and I was quite humbled, I must say. Has been there long before we were talking about social media, but he is the SVP of CRT Tanaka, did I pronounce that right? And has just worked with, I think, a world-class group of clients, and so I think we'll really get some very important perspective from him, especially on the strategy theme, which I think is really heart and soul of his work. And then Rob Gordon, Senior Vice President of Civic Leadership for City Year. Colonel Rob Gordon, correct? Okay. Correct. And so we'll get yet another perspective on how nonprofits are thinking about this whole social media space. Let me open with, I wanted to ask each of you to just kind of a quick reaction to what we heard from Josh. I think Josh did an outstanding job kind of laying out a lot of the issues. I wanted to kind of first share my reaction and just kind of see if it catalyzes some from you. I think that the thing that's really tough about strategy is that this particular space is so... The entry points to experiment, the access points, if you will, are so great that your ability to get something going relatively quickly is incredible. It's almost mind-boggling. I think about my experience at Procter & Gamble co-leading digital marketing, where getting a website up required sometimes millions of dollars, and now we're in this new content revolution where an everyday consumer, a mom down the street, can literally create brilliant content very quickly. And in many cases, having that perfect strategy up front is critical, because we don't want to steer blindly. At the same time, sometimes we stumble into strategy. As a consultant, I've done a lot of work with companies that have been forced into strategy, maybe embarrassed into strategy, because a lot of times the internet bubbles up a lot of negatives that suddenly serves as a wake-up call that suddenly brings the strategy to the table. So there isn't one, there's no silver bullet approach to this, but I'm curious to see what my panel has to say. So that's my attempt to be a little bit provocative. Geoff, I want to ask you to start, because we talked about this last night, and you do say in your book, and everything I've read, get that strategy up front.
Absolutely. Am I mic'd? Yep.
Am I mic'd? Do I need to turn it on?
No.
I'm good.
See, for a geek, I'm really bad with technology. I think the big danger with social media in general is shiny object syndrome, where people really get hooked on a tactic. So they love Twitter. Twitter is the one du jour. I think iPhone apps are quickly starting to rival that. But when you get stuck on a tactic, what happens is you have a follower count, or you have so many comments on your blog. And I loved what Josh said about that. Please don't tell me you have a Twitter strategy. Please don't tell me you have a Twitter strategy. What are you trying to do? And so without that strategy and trying to map that back to what you're, as an organization, trying to achieve, whether that's fundraising, whether that's awareness, whether that's changing perceptions, or achieving political action, you're not going to be able to do that. You're just going to have a Twitter follower account. So let me give an example of that, and then I'll pass it on. We just relaunched the Christian Children's Fund as Child Fund International. It was something I felt personally strong about because I really believe in children, but I'm a Jewish guy. And so I love the singleness of purpose. I definitely believe they were doing great work beforehand. It just it makes it more inclusive and easier for me to participate. So Child Fund International, we launched a Twitter account, but we weren't trying to just have followers. What we did was we gave a gift for every 200 followers. The donor provided extra money. And for every 200 followers, we would benefit a community in one of 4 African countries. Now, we weren't just trying to rally up follower accounts. We were trying to build stakeholders. That is to say, we would report back what those gifts were achieving in Africa. How are we benefiting these children? Why is this making a difference? We would provide videos and photos. In addition to that, we had a second objective, which was to build awareness with the influencers within the nonprofit change blogger space. And the reason why we felt that was our most important objective is influencers drive social networkers. So that's to say, yeah, you can build a Twitter account, but it doesn't mean anything.
That's a tweetable quote, by the way.
Okay,
many times over.
Or Facebook, or change.org, or Care2, whatever the social network that we're talking about. Influencers drive those networks. So you never see somebody just become important on Twitter or Care2. They're a blogger, or they run an event, or maybe they've done something special, like win the Tour de France 7 times. Things like that. I mean, the reality is that these people have done something else, and that's why people are following them. So when we get those influencers, we're really kind of creating our pinpoint strategy for future development and communications and building a larger, more interactive community. And we were successful. We achieved more than 20 blog posts, and we garnered some great initial dialogue. Now, what Child Fund International does with that from here on in is another question.
Okay, great example. We're going to come back to the influencer in a moment. Rob, you want to jump in?
Yeah, first let me thank Comcast for putting this all together. Comcast has been such an important champion and partner for City Year and the kind of work we do to help kids across the country. And I know I'm talking to the choir, preaching to the choir to this group in terms of the importance of Comcast in all of our work. So let me thank you, first of all, for doing that. You know, what's also important, I think, for nonprofits is we are all on limited budgets, let's face it. And sometimes it's daunting to take a look at the social media space and say, boy, let's get a blog going, let's get a Twitter account going. For us, it is about our strategy, first of all, in terms of outreach to children across the country to help them to succeed. We've got a core of 1,500 17 to 24-year-olds, and that helps because, of course, social media is a part of their DNA. But I will tell you, in your organization, I think it's important to find someone who understands it. And I'm hoping who's looking today, in fact, out there in Boston is Mike Messina, who's our marketing manager, who has a very good grasp of the social media space. And he just kept at it, persevering in terms of trying to get people like me and our senior leadership to take a look at what social media can do. And he was finally able to convince us to take a much closer look and understand how we could integrate this into our strategy. So along with what you said, I think there's someone in your organizations who understands this, and it could be who has been talking to you about it. You've got to find that person, you've got to listen to them, and then you do have to bump it up to the senior level because people have got to make decisions on integrating it into a strategy.
Well, I'm going to come back to another question of is it just that one person, or is it everyone, or maybe it's that one person in the early stages and then everyone. Okay. But we'll get back to that because that's really important from an organizational dynamic. Let's hear from you. So you've been, what's your take on this? Tell us about what's going on with ineighborhood.org and your work at the university.
Okay, well, thanks, Pete. I want to say to start off that the Annenberg Schools, I'm incredibly delighted to be a part of this and to be a co-sponsor of this event. Studying the effects of new media and social media on communicative practices is a big part of what we do, and obviously has big influences on both the institutions that you represent as well as overall culture and our everyday interactions. Most of my work deals with those everyday interactions.
And you partner with Pew as well, right?
On occasion we partner with Pew, yes. One of our ongoing projects actually looking at social influencers and new media deals with a report that will be released by Pew in about 3 weeks or so. And actually one of the things we've discovered of that is this
importance.
Everyone
gets early copies, I presume?
Well, not exactly, but I'm happy to talk about it during the question and answer period. The importance of those 18 to 22-year-olds and the proportion of influencers that are actually using social media and that are likely to be a part of someone's Facebook network or other social media network, and what role they play in then relaying that information to other parts of people's network and reiterating what you said, that this shouldn't be a social media strategy. This is a communication strategy that focuses on how social media then gets relayed into face-to-face contact. The majority of marketing ideas and branding opportunities are still transmitted face-to-face in situations like this. I mean, well over 90%. It's just a very small fraction. So maybe that's the role that the University of Pennsylvania plays, is dealing this with both as enthusiasm and a little bit of skepticism, in that there are costs and benefits related to this. And one thing that came up this morning is the idea of the importance of knowing your audience in terms of selecting a communication strategy. I do also want to meet that with a little bit of skepticism, in that one thing that we've discovered through ineighbors.org, which is a website that we operate that allows people to form digital communities for their geographic neighborhoods, is that the type of people who are using that technology are not at all what we expected. They're not your typical social media users. They are extremely low-income, disadvantaged communities using it in disproportionate ways. People of 35 years of age and older using it to mobilize their communities, largely because those who are under 35 who haven't started families yet are just not interested in neighboring. So it's an entirely different demographic than you would normally associate with a social media strategy. So some of the things we've looked at are, how new media is changing community relationships at the neighborhood level, how new wireless technologies are changing interaction in public spaces, and then with this forthcoming Pew report, how our influencers are being changed and our discussion networks are changing as a result of social media.
So let me pick up on a comment that was made about, you were giving some examples of how you apply this. Influencers, for example, was brought up. I mean, how much of the strategy is just really about taking your core foundations and breathing new life into them or making them stronger? What's interesting about, everyone says social media influencers are really moving the market. Well, influencers have always moved the market. We've always spent quite a bit of time and energy, and I'm sure all of you have, in influencing your newsmakers, your offline key influencers. Although today it's quite complex. There must be, 60 New York Times reporters that also have Twitter accounts. And they're kind of fanning the flames of their commentary. So but is it really about just thinking about, these core pillars of what we already need to do to be successful? We talked about understanding our customer. Now it's influencers. And then wrapping social media around that. I mean, who wants to talk about that? Because maybe that's the way we ultimately sell this through, most efficiently in organizations large and small.
Mm-hmm. Well, influencers, think of fans, for example, and how you can build a fan base through a social media campaign. Right. For City Year, again, our core members are the target. They're 17 to 24-year-olds. We did research with Arnold Worldwide to take a look at how many young people would do full-time service across the country if they knew it existed, and 7 million would. This whole notion that this generation is not engaged, for example, is not true. They want to be engaged, they have causes, they want to serve their communities. And then the question is, how do you outreach to those? And then who are the influencers within that group that can help radiate that message? And this is where the social media architecture really comes to fore. I think it's also devising a strategy about how to integrate the architecture together. So we have a Twitter account. Yes, we have over 2,100 followers on Twitter in City Year. We have 3,900 fans on Facebook. But once again, how do you integrate that in very powerful ways so that the influencers can be your fans, carry your message, and then radiate that message out? So
I partly hear you saying wider funnel to capture those who are, capture is probably not the right word, but those who are already very excited about participation.
Absolutely.
Whether the internet was around or not, but you're looking at, expanding the channels to, bring them in, make sure they even know that you're around, right?
Absolutely, and have them get content from you that they can personalize, and then they can disseminate themselves, because this is a generation that likes to personalize online. My generation is very uncomfortable with that. I see some around in the room who are part of my generation, and we just don't like to put ourselves out there many times. And I've had to learn that. I do have a Facebook account, and a little bit of an anecdote is I had a conference call yesterday with the president of the CEO of Public Allies, Paul Smits. And as we were getting people onto the conference call, he says, "Hey, Rob, I hear you're going to be a part of the new media conference at Comcast." And I said, "Hey, That's right. How'd you know that? He said, I read your Facebook account. So we have to also, my generation, get very comfortable with that. But, you know, it's key, I think, the integration, basically, of social media in terms of an architecture to have resonance and power.
Okay, excellent. Geoff, you want to jump on that?
Sure. Alison Fine wrote a great book. It's called Momentum. It's for nonprofits. Her handle on Twitter is afine, F-I-N-E. Great lady. And the dirty secret about social media, which backs you up, is that you have to do a face-to-face meeting at some point.
Yeah.
And that's because you're building relationships. And so when you have these extended stakeholders or influencers, and if we go back to the Obama campaign, other than donating, what was the second call to action? Meetup, right? Back to you again. You want to meet with people. You want to build advisors. You want to build an extended organization. So if you look at your enterprise and the way we tend to silo things, from a nonprofit standpoint, we've got fundraising, we've got donations. Maybe we have the people that actually fulfill whatever the work is, maybe training the homeless, maybe a kitchen, whatever it could be. Well, all your volunteers are part of your extended network. All your fundraisers are part of your extended network. Now you're just embracing them. One of my favorite tactics is advisory boards. And this is really for the high-powered influencers. But did you bring your donors in on boards and have them go out and fundraise for you? In the technology business, then we ask industry analysts to be on our advisory board or participate in special events.
Much easier to administer now.
Yeah, it's cheaper, it's free. Maybe you do an event once a year instead of having to fly all over the country and do things like that. And instead, you can use your Facebook group or even a private main group to do that kind of stuff.
Are many doing that? Using social networks for advisory groups or big opportunity. It's much easier to administer. And as a participant, I've actually found it much easier to say yes, because they'll say, well, you don't have to be at all the meetings, you can just participate in a few of our online sites. But I find myself almost more of an advocate for the group because of some of those online activities, which is really important, because part of this is like, how do you take, you're all in the business where you have donors, you have advocates, you have people that are very passionate about your cause. And I wanted to ask the group about this notion of social currency. I mean, nonprofits typically have some level of social currency. It may be, feeling good. I made a donation, and here is the tangible reward. But what is it that really, motivates the community? What are the things that, beyond just saying thank you for the donation, that you can, provide to a social network that just kind of further builds that excitement and momentum? Is it the video of the end result? Is it? I don't know. I'm thinking out loud here. Anyone want to?
Sure. I would say that people want to connect. Those in the community want to help us do our work. And the beauty of social media is we could give them the chance to do that. And that comes with having a strategy in terms of the types of content that you do put on your website, and then allowing people to take that content to help you do your work. I will say that in addition to what you were talking about, the advisory boards, we've found that thought leaders really help us in our work. And these are people in the industry who really understand it. They're the experts. And oftentimes, if you invite them in, they will come. They will come help you do your work. So I think it's outreach to them through the space, and also then taking the work and the advice that they have to help you be better at your mission.
I think one thing you'll find, I mean, how many of you just know how many social media experts there are in your Philadelphia region? I'm from Cincinnati, and I was just blown away at how many there were out there. And they're all really eager to give, to kind of contribute, lend help. To some extent, that dignifies their expertise in the area. But if you go to Twitter, here's a great Twitterable. There's over 60,000 people that declare themselves social media experts. For consultants like myself, it's terrifying. But but that's good news for all of you, because there are folks that have touched it. They can, they may not be as strategic as a Geoff, but they can help in ways. Now, I wanted to let me ask you. Josh talked about starting points of strategy, and one of them was listening. Do you agree with that? Before you lay out the strategy, figure out where you're going to start, Twitter or whatever it might be, how important is that listening piece of the equation? How much can it guide the strategy in terms of, tapping into what all of these voices are saying about your brand or your nonprofit and the like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's integral. But great variation across organizations. I mean, the goal of your organization should drive, what you do in the first step. And many organizations, may not know what their constituents are. You may not know, who's going to be attracted to the social media that you want to employ. Things happen in unexpected ways, and I think you should be open to that as well. I mean, you don't know who the influencers are in your particular community. I mean, there are a very small number of people, but one of the brilliant things about social media is it attracts the experts, right? I mean, it brings those people who are searching for you to you in ways that they never would have, they never would have found you before. And I think that's where, the real power is, at least early on.
And so give an example in the context of iNeighborhoods.org. Are you constantly measuring the pulse? Are you kind of trying to figure out what the, we talked a little bit on the phone about some of your recent insights about wireless. Did that emanate from conversation in the communities, or does that come from another source? I mean,
right. Well, iNeighbors is a little bit of an exception to the rule in that we're not exactly a nonprofit. We're a research experiment, right? So we have an interest in measuring the pulse, but at the same time, the goal is to see who uses the technology and how. And we have some trepidation about moving the technology in a way that people want it versus in a way that we just want to see what happens. So many people, for example, would love to see us integrate Twitter, blogs, and everything else in iNeighbors, and we don't. We get probably 10 to 20 emails a day asking for it. But the reality is that most of our users are over the age of 35, don't know how to blog, don't know how to tweet. If we provided it, it would look like empty dead space on our site, and it would never be utilized. So there's a balance between being responsive to those who know the technology and really want to utilize it, and what you think your audience really is. But in terms of measuring the response, I mean, the pulse, the biggest finding that we have is it's used in really unexpected ways. I mean, people in the 20% most disadvantaged neighborhoods in America are disproportionately represented by far on iNeighbors, and they shouldn't be there. Everything we know about the digital divide, everything we know about how really disadvantaged communities work at the local level suggests that they shouldn't be organizing online to use that technology. And if we had followed that traditional understanding, we never would have had that wonderful discovery and empowered those residents in ways that we didn't anticipate.
Hence the power of listening.
Absolutely.
I mean, so others, I mean, does listening precede strategy?
It's hard to be in a relationship with anybody in any facet of life if you don't listen to them. So
did you say that in 145?
Yeah. I mean, it's just one-on-one. It's the whole sales guy thing when you go into a car dealer and they don't give you the time of day and they just tell you what you need. And I mean, that's the same thing online. We have a methodology in our agency, which is something that we developed when I had my own company before I sold it. And we don't start anything for any organization without spending at least a month or two listening on behalf of that organization. Because if you do that, first of all, we're a lot more successful than most agencies, and the reason why is because we listen. And when you listen to people, they'll tell you what they want, believe it or not. And if you give them what they want, they're usually pretty happy about it. That's to say, for example, a nonprofit may feel like, we really need donors. Well, if you get online, your stakeholders are telling you, well, we'll donate, but however, we don't really want to talk to you about perhaps, let's just say liver cancer, or there's a name for that, God. Anyway, so they don't want to talk about liver cancer, they want to talk about cancer research and whether or not that's working and how it can be changed and how we can drive that. Well, then instead of talking about liver cancer, talk about the issue. It's really simple. But companies miss and organizations miss that nuance. They want to talk about what they want to talk about. There's one other aspect of listening which is really important, and that's inside. Because without fail, somewhere in your organization, there's a lawyer or an IT guy or somebody inside that's going to probably provide a significant barrier. And if you can go through the organization and talk to people about social media before you launch, you'll probably be able to navigate that barrier a lot easier.
Folks identify with that? I generally find they're not as severe as we think. I think we have a tendency to kind of almost like stereotype these roles, and I've actually found that you'd be surprised what a couple conversations with the lawyers will do. I find that most of them have kids that are using social networks, and there's ways that you can break down the barriers. But you're right, it is a huge perceived barrier, and I think everyone needs to be worked. Any builds on this?
No, I would just say I want to reinforce what you just talked about in terms of not only listening, but who's listening within the organization, and then how you then translate that listening to some sort of action in terms of your strategy and your objectives. And you're exactly right. There'll be some naysayers in the organization, some by dint of their jobs. I mean, they should be, because once again, with social media, you don't have control once you have this platform out there where people can take and personalize and share and comment, and not all those comments are going to be good. So there are some in the organization who want to protect your brand, to ensure that you have privacy and security. But there is a balance, and that's why in terms of that listening, you do have to have the channels within the organization to be able to understand it and then ensure that you are making changes or adjusting in accordance with what your mission is.
What about where we do have control and leverage? Because it's almost becoming cliche to say the consumer's in control. I'm probably the most guilty person of saying that. But, you know, we still control a lot of levers. I mean, we build products and services. We can elect to answer the phone and be polite or not. You know, we can have employees that treat customers or donors with dignity, and all of that can spill into, for better or for worse, the social media airwaves. But I mean, what are the things that we can, without even starting lifting a single finger in social media, what are the things that nonprofits in particular do that have the potential to echo into the social media space?
They can act. I mean, I think we control our own actions, so we're really not responsible for what other people do, but we are responsible for our reactions or the actions that perhaps provoke their reaction. So I deal with blogger dramas a lot because I launch a lot of organizations and their efforts out there. And we find that these things don't get out of hand if we comment quickly. We don't necessarily even have to answer people satisfactorily. We can't please everybody in this world.
Yeah.
We just say, hey, you know, we're listening, and unfortunately, you know, we can't really help you out with that. But that's really what the organization has control of.
Yeah.
I think when we do that, we manage expectation, too. Because, you know, and that's important.
There's authenticity to our work and the
Okay,
kind of
say
work
more
that we
about
do. And, you know, with City Year, of course, we're working with kids to help them to succeed in high-poverty communities across the nation in 20 different cities. And, you know, we deploy young people to do that in teams. And these young people, 17 to 24 years of age, are committed, they're dedicated, they're enthusiastic, and they work every single day to make lives better for kids. And that's authentic. So, you know, when people see that sort of authenticity, that does radiate out when it comes time to lose control to a degree of your message, when you have that authenticity. So I think that's the kind of thing that the nonprofit community brings in spades to the kind of work that we do across the country.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I would encourage everyone to really think about what are the aspects of what you do that just, I sometimes call them talk drivers. I do think authenticity is a huge talk driver. In fact, I think a big reason why a lot of companies are creating blogs or even do some of the Twitter, it's really an effort to come across as more authentic, less like an advertiser, more first person, you know, less third person, you know, short form, not long form. And that does seem to resonate very, very well in the conversational airwaves. But oftentimes it emanates from almost an offline principle. It may be in your founding document that, you know, we're real and sincere and passionate about the City Year mission. It may be similar with what you're doing on your front. But really think about those things that to some extent bleed over online or sometimes reward you. Similarly, the things that potentially could damage you. For example, mismanaging promises tends to be an incredibly viral, you know, what you say in terms of what consumers get is where a lot of advertisers get in trouble. They overstate claims, and the internet really can serve as a punishment mechanism. Anything else about the listening piece? Well, before we get to the questions, you know, here's our client, our collective client, and we're getting them started on social media strategy. Where do they start? Is it okay if they start a Twitter account, or do they have to wait until the perfect strategy document is lined up? Are there, I mean, because sometimes the experiment leads to the strategy. I mean, where can they start? Everyone's going to have a different take on this.
You know, I think it's great to participate, and I'm sorry. I think it's great to participate early, but I think it's important to ask questions and not go out there and make sweeping statements or launch your effort. You know, we're just here learning. And you don't have to say it in those terms, but just that humility to the effort is important, because otherwise you can set yourself on a path that you don't want to with that promise.
Right.
No, you're right. I mean, you know, our organization, 1,500 core members, 400 staff, we can take a piece and experiment, for example, in terms of social media. We're doing that. I have with me Meredith Hollingsworth, who's going to oversee our social media campaign in terms of our recruiting strategy. So we can take recruiting, basically, and we can focus our social media campaign there and do a lot of learning before it's pervasive throughout the organization where everyone hasn't quite bought in yet. So I think it's important to find some small wins initially in terms of social media and allow experimentation, because you're going to fail at a few things. Let's face it. But you're going to learn from that and then be able to put that into a larger sort of campaign if you are very, very deliberate about ensuring that you can test it, I think, in a certain part of your organization and learn from that.
Keith, aside from coming to this incredible event, what would you recommend as a couple starting points for...
Well, I mean, this is the first time I've spoken to a non-profit crowd, so I'm not sure I have good advice for starting points.
Profit, I mean, it's social media.
I mean, I do say, I mean, what's the rush? I mean, I don't think that there's much to be lost by waiting to get into the social media landscape. I mean, there will always be a next Twitter.
And that's a strategy, too.
There really will be. And, I mean, knowing what your organizational goals are, and I actually disagree. I think that being tepid when you're ready to go in is a mistake. I think you go in and you go in full force. I mean, I think that... I mean, from a broader kind of perspective, I think one of the mistakes that Microsoft makes in this realm is that they're a desktop company, and when they come to dealing with the web and social media, they tepidly step in, try something out, and retreat. No, I mean, this isn't something you do for 6 months. I mean, this is an organizational change. I mean, this isn't an organizational strategy. It's something that you go in and you do for the long term. And you should be ready when you go in there, and be sure you're ready to go in there before you step in.
Well, you do beg an interesting question of first mover or fast follower. And it is true. You can actually learn on a lot of other people's nickels. You know, because people are doing it. They've learned the hard way. Some have actually leapfrogged ahead of you. But there's a lot of, the one thing that is true about the social media environment, a lot of case studies get written. Sure. I can't even keep up with them on Twitter. Anything else? Do we have some questions? Let's get a few questions up. Be nice to us.
Several of the same question from different people, so I'll ask this one.
Okay.
This one comes from Nancy Santiago Negron, and I also got the same question from Keenan Wilson. So
must be a good one.
It's a good one. It's about liability. So they asked, what's the biggest liability nonprofits should consider before entering the social media space, and what would you recommend to mitigate any of these liabilities?
Who wants to take that one on?
Go ahead.
You, after you.
Liability in terms of legal liability or just...
They weren't clear on that.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Clearly, a risk, as we have been talking about, is losing control of your message. And that's something that you have to think about in terms of how you would respond to that, whether you would respond or whether you would have some sort of campaign to do so. And this is where authenticity comes to play, to ensure that you are authentic. I will tell you, though, that you do have to think about those things in terms of, for example, for City Year, you know, our logo and our symbol is proprietary. We want to have some control over that symbol and what it means and how it radiates. And we have a uniform as well that we wear. So you have to think about all those things in terms of when the social networking space can redefine those things, and then the strategy that you might have in terms of either allowing the space to redefine it in accordance with your authenticity or taking action accordingly. So what happens when you have videos out there, for example, and people will take ownership over those videos and use them in different sorts of ways? Exactly right. Exactly right. So those are the kinds of things in terms of liability that you have to consider.
Yeah, this is a real catch-22 because we all want word of mouth.
Right.
We all want our influencers to carry forth our message and use whatever, garnish it with whatever branding we have, except when it's negative. And it's hard to kind of play it both sides.
Yes,
and so to some extent, there's a whole calculated risk going on.
Absolutely.
I would say the biggest liability is mission, getting off mission. And I know with nonprofits there isn't very much regulation unless, for example, we work with the Charles Schwab Foundation and they have the SEC issues to worry about. But in general, there isn't very much regulation. So legally, I don't see a lot. What I do see a lot of issues with are guide star ratings, things like that, how funding is being allocated, how your discussion relates back to the mission, or whether or not you're just kind of goofing off online. And so have a purpose before you really initiate your social media effort. Otherwise, you can really damage your reputation online with your stakeholders.
Can we take a live one? I'm going to say take a live one. I'm in control. Okay. Please.
Thank you. My name's Sarah, and I work with the charitable wing of the Philadelphia Eagles. And on Sunday, we had an inaugural event that raised $1 million. It was at the stadium. There were 30,000 people. The very next day, we sent out a survey to everybody who bought tickets online through Ticketmaster, and in less than 24 hours, we had 895 responses, overwhelmingly positive. At the event, we streamed the event live on the Eagles website. And so yesterday I spent about a half an hour looking at the message boards on the Eagles website. So here are the people at the event, overwhelmingly positive response. But there were a lot of things happening at the event. There was a practice, there were jersey giveaways, there were lots of random prize giveaways. The people who were watching it online, of course, weren't eligible for any of those giveaways. So every time there was a jersey given away or something happened, they would be writing, they would kind of be swearing online about what the F, I don't care about this stuff. I want to see the practice. Why did they cut away from the practice? What's with the section 20, whatever. And so it was really interesting because we tried multiple ways to connect with people through social media, and for the people who were at the event, it was very strong, and for the people who weren't, what we were hoping was they'd get a glimpse of this and say, gee, I wish I was there, I want to be there next year, and instead they got ticked off because they weren't getting to see, sort of the avid Eagles fan wasn't getting to see the full practice. So using that as a real example, if you were analyzing that and giving me some advice for next year on how to work with social media around this, we drove people to it through Twitter. We set up Twitter to drive, through a Facebook account, through the web boards on the Eagles website. What would your advice be for what I should be listening to and learning from that experience?
That's a good one. I'm almost curious to know what you think the moral of the story is. Who wants to? That's a great case.
I'll start. Okay. So, two things. One, there's probably some valid feedback in what you should, because video is very hard, so cutting and making editorial decisions there, and I'm not very good at video, but definitely you want to take some of that input. But on the prize stuff, I would actually think that's good. When Nikon D80 launched its blogger relations campaign, they put these really expensive cameras in all these photo bloggers' hands. There was a big stick on the internet about who got what. Well, you go to a blogger conference today, guess what the brand most bloggers are using? It's Nikon, because they all wanted it. And so when I hear, well, I didn't get a jersey, I can't participate, well, great, sign up for next year. We're so sorry you couldn't get a jersey, but if you attend next year, you can. And so I would look at some of that as a good opportunity to engage those negative comments and bring them in. I mean, negativity isn't always just like, oh, God, they said bad things about me. It's an opportunity to engage your stakeholder, and in some cases, they're drumming interest.
Absolutely. And you can empower some of them as a result. I mean, I'm sure there are a few who commented again and again and again. You can figure out who those are and actually turn them into your champions potentially as well. I think the instructive point, though, is that you were listening and that you were reading. I mean, someone has to, within the organization, then consume the social media information that we're getting. A perfect example, and I had mentioned the fact that we're on Facebook, City Year. We have a Twitter account, and the question is, so what? And, we look at, for example, who's coming to our website, and we're now finding that the top 3 sources for young people coming to our website, or anyone, are all social media sources. It's Twitter, it's Wikipedia, and it's Facebook. But we wouldn't know that unless we had someone looking at it and analyzing it. So I think one of the instructive points here, too, is you have to have someone who's able to do that and then figure out how you can turn that into cake.
Chris, any comments on that before I jump in?
Keith, yes.
Keith, sorry.
Well, I mean, one thing I want to say is that, one thing we haven't talked about is it doesn't have to be a here and a there experience, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be what happens out there in social media and then what happens here physically in place. You can combine the two. I would look at ways of using social media at the event to encourage different degrees of participation, whether it's prize giveaways or finding people with similar interests or engaging them with the players in some way or another. But by doing that, the people who are potentially out there in that social realm that's online might have a way of engaging with those who are physically present at the event, and it might encourage a greater sense of what that place really is that you're holding this event.
I think you're going to have mixed results on all these campaigns, from offline, online reactions. I do think there's some watch-outs about not, having, kind of promotions or rewards offline but not online, and you may want to think about how to equalize that. I think the downside of too much negativity online is it does tend to recirculate into search results, and that can really start to do sustaining damage to the brand. So while there is an argument that debate drives engagement and all publicity is good publicity, there's a point where if there's too much of a pile-up, that can create a lot of negative momentum, and you don't want a situation where people type in, your brand into Google and all you see are a bunch of nasty grams. So you have to think about how to, neutralize some of that. Good, great question. Please.
We have a question from April White online. She's asking how an organization can reshape its social media effort to meet new or newly conceived objectives after it already has a Facebook, Twitter, blog, etc.
You mean like re-energize the campaign? Okay. Keith, do you want to take the first crack at that one?
Well, I'm not sure. Re-energize the campaign. It shouldn't be a campaign about Facebook. It should be a campaign about the organization and how you use different types of communication technologies to both engage your constituents and project the image of your organization. So I think that framing it around, re-energizing my Facebook presence is probably a mistake. I don't know what to say. How do you, revive, one social media and not the others? Well, you don't. You aim for some kind of global project that engages people on and offline.
I'll slightly amend the question and see whether it adds some. Is it okay to cut bait at times? A lot has changed on MySpace last year versus this year. Are there some instances where we say, okay, we're just not seeing the results and we've got other areas where there's more attention? Is that one way of kind of revitalizing the campaign, or is...
Yeah. Well, the landscape is always changing. I actually am reading Josh's book, The Groundswell, and it was interesting. I was, when the first one, I'm not sure this first edition was published, I think around 2006, when MySpace, of course, was dominant. Now Facebook has become dominant. The landscape's constantly changing. So I think you have to do that assessment in terms of whether to cut bait or not. It's really doing an assessment of the changing landscape and then how you can, once again, tailor your strategy online based on what your overall objectives and strategies are within your organization. So constant reassessing, I think, is absolutely essential.
Would you ever tell a client to just cut
Yeah, absolutely
Okay.
will. Chapter 6 of my book, which is called Now Is Gone, Plug Done. It's called Think Liquid. There's a podcast version of it on the Now Is Gone site, so you can get it for free. But that's an old art of war strategy, where you move like water, wherever there's least resistance. And the reality is, if you build a real community online for your nonprofit, you're going to know where they are. So if they move to Brightkite because they're all on mobile phones and they're like doing location-based social networking because they're kids or whatever, great. Then move to Brightkite and put up something on your MySpace page that says, hey, we've moved to Brightkite. This is where you can find us. We're sorry for those of you that are diehard MySpace fans. We certainly hope you'll join us over there. If you have that low of participation, then you need to do it. With social, it's so time-consuming. You can really only do 2 or 3 social network properties well, in my opinion.
I think there's an organizational dynamic as well, having studied large and small organizations, that if you let something gather cobwebs for too long, it does really empower the naysayers. And if it doesn't look like it's really achieving objective or isn't going to pick up momentum, or everyone's moved on to the next big thing, it might make sense just to shutter it and move on and focus your efforts, because you don't want too much tangible evidence of something that didn't work out according to plan. Can we take one back here? Okay, let's get the mic up to the back in the red. Pink, red.
Thanks. I'm wondering, as you start to identify some new media objectives and maybe phase in and implement strategies, what do you typically see organizations doing about the old media, ways that they're operating with newsletters and conference calls and emails and other ways of communicating?
Good question.
Who wants to jump on that one?
And I'll talk about that as well.
So Josh ended his speech when he was talking about you have to have that URL and insert it. In advertising terms, that's a call to action. Email newsletters, if they're different than what you're putting out on the social web, great call to action and a great way to get people to identify who they are. Webinars, all those different types of marketing should be integrated in. As far as traditional media relations goes, I think there's almost a cutback that needs to happen because there's less media now, and that's a great place to fund your social web time. Not necessarily saying getting rid of it, because the New York Times will always be the New York Times, but just balancing it a little bit.
We do both in City Year. Let me once again tout the Comcast relationship. Comcast has been very gracious to put our ads up basically on their channels, for example. And so when you take a look at our targets, it not only includes 17 to 24-year-olds, we want to join the core, but also funders as well, who tend to be, of course, older, and we saw some of the data around that, and may be more responsive, or at least be able to consume more old media channels than some of the new media. So for us, it's a combination of both.
Think about everything that you're currently doing that you can port over. I'm working with the BBB on the side, and one of the things they've started to do is take, they give away torch awards every year, and it's a huge event. I mean, in local communities, getting a torch award. And now they're starting to YouTube the presentations. They're having the CEO kind of sort of say, this is why Company X received the torch award. And you know what happens? The people that get those awards put it on their website, they send it to everyone, and what was the incremental effort that was needed? But it's taking something that you're already doing, this notion of rewards and recognition, and how does social media amplify it, create a dividend multiplier. Think about how you can actually get more dividends or rewards based on what you're currently doing. Another question. Do we have time for another one or two?
One or two more.
One or two more. Okay, great. The questions are excellent, I think.
Yeah.
No, real quick follow-up.
Yeah, please. Please. That's a critical.
And it is critical that one could approach both traditional and then new media from a siloed perspective, right? Or integrate the two very powerfully. And I think the latter is what we want to achieve. How to effectively integrate that based on the example that you just talked about. Mm-hmm.
Please.
Okay. I'm hearing a lot of talk about listening to your consumers or whoever your customer is, and in light of our nonprofit budgets where we really don't have the money to hire, consultants or focus groups and that kind of stuff, before we jump into social media, how do we listen to our consumers and find out what would benefit them the most?
So
many places.
There was a suggestion about is it okay to participate before we really communicate? And that's really how you do it. I mean, you join the social networks, you find the friends, you join similar organizations, their efforts online, because God forbid there's never a truly unique nonprofit anymore, it seems like. There's always several people in a space or related spaces. So get in there and really listen and hear what people are talking about. Participate in those conversations.
But specifically, there's a lot of free tools that are out there. I'm in the business of selling tools and analytics, but you don't need to go that far. You can actually go to a blog search engine. You can go to Twitter search. You can even use Google to start to get a real quick sense. Sometimes all you need is a quick gut check. I'm always amazed at how the power of one testimonial will motivate management. It's really easy to find that. So just start with the real obvious stuff, the big trend lines. Is anyone talking about my charity? And you're always going to be surprised. I guarantee that. I mean, do you agree? It's like what you were saying earlier. There's always something that is almost a bit counterintuitive, but that leads to insight, and insight leads to strategy.
Right.
The social web is built on search. So,
good point. Good point.
So
yes.
Last question, and this is from the Twitter stream. It's from Nancy
Yeah,
at Nancy Negron. For those following, and she wants to know, how did you guys start your social media strategy? Do you start slowly or do you start full force, and what would you recommend others do?
Great question.
For us it was The beauty of some of our organizations is you have people dying to do this sort of thing. They understand it a little more. You've got to get the buy-in eventually from, of course, your executive leadership to really ensure it's integrated to an overall strategy. But I would start with basically your organization to see who's excited about it and who can understand it. And this is where thought leaders come to play as well. There are people out there, let me tell you, who do want to help and can help us basically think through some of the issues, concerns, challenges early on, so we just don't jump out there. And some would recommend that, but we just don't jump out there willy-nilly. And then learn, and learning is important, but learn in areas where we could use wisdom instead of some thought leaders. So I recommend those two things. Find people who are passionate about it. Then it's important for the senior leadership to buy into it, and then surround yourself with thought leaders along the way to help you.
Jeff?
I would say because, I mean, the nature of my business, I'm a hired gun, so it's with a purpose.
As I said before, I mean, I think that the big mistake a lot of organizations made is not being prepared to enter the space. I mean, entering it tepidly with the belief that you can test the waters for a short period of time and then retreat when you can't show that it has definite outcomes or that there's not, there's some pushback within the organization or even amongst your constituents. I think that you go into it full force with the expectation that you're going to be there in the long term, and you go in ready for that.
And I say follow your passion. And don't be afraid to start your own personal blog, even if it's creating up a little family album. You'll be amazed at how quickly it will help you to telegraph to bigger business ideas. My favorite blog is dedicated to my twins, dosbebes.com, and it is, I'd love to credit Nielsen with all my great, wisdom, if you can call it wisdom, but a lot of it's inspired from that just every day, and that's a safe zone. We're not putting our firms at risk by putting up family photos, but that's kind of a good way of understanding the feedback loop, and you'll find yourself running into the office with a memo, maybe even with tangible evidence to boot, that really gets things going. So don't underestimate the small experiments.
So before we go to a break, we have a question from online, which is for those of you who have Twitter handles, if you could mention them quickly so they can follow you.
Yes, mine's Keith N. Hampton.
I'm Geoff Living, one word.
I'm Rob Gordon, CY, as in city year.
P. Blackshaw.
And we will include these in a slide and probably some crons as we move forward, so we'll make that, thank you, whomever raised that online, and we'll make that change. So now we're going to go to a break. Folks online, you're going to hear some lovely music for about 10 minutes, and then we will be right back with you. Folks in the room, we have some snacks down the hall. We haven't figured out how to give you snacks online, so I'm sorry. But we'll work on that for next time. We'll be back in 10.
Thanks to the panel. Thanks very much.